In a big fancy world where people have a lot of money, not everything is what it looks like. Jane is a young woman who gets married into a rich family, but this new life is full of secrets and lies. In a house where no one can be trusted, love turns into a game, and betrayal is everywhere. But when hate starts to look like love, who will give in first? In this story, every choice can be dangerous, and feelings are as wild as a storm. As the truth starts to come out, friendships change, and hidden secrets are revealed. Who will stay standing when everything falls apart? There are important lessons here. The dangers of being greedy, how strong a woman can be, how love can change everything, and how betrayal always has a cost. Get ready for a story full of surprises, where nothing is easy, and every moment is a new challenge. This isn't just a story, it's an adventure. Sit up and enjoy. Jane felt the sting of heavy slaps landing on her face, the sound almost reverberating around the room. "What have I done wrong?" she cried. Her father watched me do it like you did with the shoes, he coldly asked. He enjoyed the play of fear on her face. He tightened his grip on her throat and watched her squirm for release as her hands instinctively went for his hands on her neck. Jane could feel the air around her suddenly vanishing. Her face was flushed with fear and desperation as she tugged on his hands around her neck. "Let go of me!" she suddenly screamed as the air left her lungs. Her eyes had become misty, and she gave out a loud cough as he suddenly freed her, causing her to hit her butt hard on the bare floor. "That makes the two of us," he pointed out, his eyes glimmering with fresh pride at what he had done to her. He was off the floor and back on his feet. Taking a fierce look at her on the floor, he sighed heavily before wiping the non-existent dust off his body. "If you ever repeat what you did here today, I will make sure you're chased into the streets where you belong." Did he suddenly forget that she had asked for a divorce already? Or was he just bluffing? She was set to piss him off more often than necessary, if that's what it took to have him grant her a divorce. She had an appointment with Mr. Todd, one of her mother's business associates who was interested in buying her share of the family business. If he could pay up immediately, the shares were transferred to his company. She would be able to book an appointment with the doctor and have Liam's surgery bills paid. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Kenneth, John's despicable younger brother. "Bro, sister-in-law, hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said, trying hard to hide the smirk on his face. "What do you want?" John asked without responding to his question. Ken's gaze swept over Jane's flushed face before resting on his brother's. "I came to see you." It was time for her to leave the room. She would rather be outside in the sun than in the same room with the two brothers. As she walked towards the open door, she brushed past Ken and gave him a fierce glare, enough to have him roasted if glares possessed such powers. He didn't know whose presence repulsed him the most between Jane's and his brothers. John motioned for Ken to speak. He wanted him gone as soon as possible. "Mr. Todd brought some documents he wants you to sign." Ken held out the documents to him, not daring to meet his gaze. "What is it about?" John asked. Ken gave out a fake cough before adjusting his already done collar. "Your wife wants to sell her own share of the family business to him." John's eyes snapped open with interest as he snatched the papers from Ken. He sneered as he read through the contents of the documents. "So this is why she's confidently asking for a divorce. He would make sure nobody buys the shares from her." Turning to his brother, he coldly demanded, "Ask my wife to see me." She had left the room to breathe in some fresh air. Sharing the same space with John felt suffocating, not because he took her breath away with desire, but because he filled her with repulsion. She gently touched her belly, caressing it dreamily. Whether she knew the father of her child or not, she was determined to keep the baby. She had been hesitant before, unsure of her decision, but now she was resolute. She would raise this child with or without her family's support, and that would only be possible if she could divorce John. A voice interrupted her thoughts. She instinctively placed her hands on her still flat belly, protecting her unborn child. Her motherly instincts were already kicking in, even though the baby was barely formed. She turned to find Ken smiling down at her, his gaze flirtatious despite his brother being just a few meters away. Startled, she asked, "What do you want? Can I check up on my brother's wife? Or has it suddenly become a crime to care about you?" He replied, his earlier silly smirk now more profound with John's absence. "If your brother sees you flirting with me, he will definitely have your head on a platter," she fired back. Sneering, he slowly whispered, "Doesn't look like I'm the one about to be killed. Your husband wants to see you right now." She nervously walked back into the room, eager yet scared to find out what she had done wrong. As soon as she entered, John threw a stack of documents at her, the ones his brother had brought in earlier. "Is this why you wanted a divorce so much?" he shouted. She couldn't believe her eyes. The documents she was supposed to sign with Mr. Todd were now on the floor. How did John get them? Was Mr. Todd his business partner? Questions raced through her mind as she took a few steps backward, aware of how violent John could be. "How did you get these documents?" she demanded calmly, careful not to aggravate his already steaming anger. "You still have the nerve to ask me questions? Did you think I wouldn't find out about your involvement with Mr. Todd?" he snarled. "But I haven't done anything wrong. I needed the money to—" Raising his hand, he snapped at her so hard that she flinched in pain. "Oh, shut up and save me the sermon. You wanted the money to elope with a new lover. I will make sure every single cent he pays you goes directly into my account. If you want a divorce, you might as well pay back every single dime my family spent on you and your family during the marriage rites." She opened her mouth to speak, but quickly decided against it. "And I mean every single dime," he added. Why was he so bent on punishing her? She could endure all the torture and pain of staying married to him. But her brother's life was at stake. It was the only way out of it. "Why are you doing this? You don't need the money. Why do you derive so much joy from hurting me?" she shouted, shooting an angry stare at him. His eyes squinted almost immediately. "Do you think my family picks money from trees? I bet if it were so, people like you and your useless family wouldn't be as wretched as you are." She took a few more steps backward before continuing. "I swear I didn't get a dime from the money your father gave to my family. They should be the ones paying back, not me." "Then get them to pay," he sneered. In tears, she hurried back outside. Even if she told him what she needed the money for, he wouldn't budge. She had already signed her part of the documents, which meant she no longer had access to the ownership of the business. It was now his. Suddenly her phone rang. "Meet me at Melina Lounge," a hoarse voice stated. He couldn't believe the lengths she was going to divorce him. Did she really hate him that much? Well, he didn't care. She could hate him all she wanted. He would never sign the divorce papers, not even if her life depended on it. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Sir, your mother is here. She's waiting downstairs." Why did his mom always act like a stranger each time she visited her own house? In the living room, he saw her grinning widely as he descended the stairs. "Hello, son. You don't look well at all. Is your wife not taking care of you like she should?" "I can arrange for—" "Mom, I'm okay. Thanks for asking." He cut her off abruptly. Touching his cheek, she peered into his eyes as if doubting his words. He was not a child, plus they had many maids in the mansion, and she knew that. "Where is she?" she finally asked. "Who?" "Your wife, of course." John paused before asking a servant to fetch Jane from her room. Jane, almost forgetting she had a difficult mother-in-law, clambered down the stairs excitedly. "Hello, mother-in-law," she greeted. The middle-aged woman forced a smile. "Why are you looking so unkempt and frail?" she asked, her tone ambiguous. Was she taunting or genuinely concerned? Jane couldn't tell. The woman was no different from her despicable son. Sometimes she wished he had taken after his father's gentle nature. "I'm okay. Anyways, that's not why I'm here," she snapped. "I want to know if you've been taking care of my son like you ought to. He is the sole reason why you're here in the first place. Of course, you must know that he's the reason your family is finally experiencing good things." Jane looked at her husband, who had an expressionless look on his face, making it impossible to tell what was going through his mind. Standing up from his seat, he brushed past the two women. "Mom, I will be having a session in the next few minutes. I need to get ready." You go with him, or have you suddenly forgotten your duties? Jane wiped her brows nervously. No, ma'am. He was preparing for his swimming classes. He didn't need to swim to stay fit. He was already fit, but his nosy doctor would never accept that. Suddenly, he heard a knock on the door. He knew it was her. Come in, he answered, waiting until she pushed the bathroom door open and slowly entered. Jane couldn't believe her eyes. Her husband was lying in the bathtub, leisurely drinking from a wineglass. Was he choosing the bathtub over the pool? She stared at his almost exposed chest and quickly looked away embarrassed. I don't think you need me since you're opting for this instead. Why are you feeling uncomfortable watching me bathe? He asked, his cheek flushed with embarrassment. Not at all. I just feel you wouldn't need me, she muttered under her breath. Well, that's on the contrary because I need my feet massaged. She ran to the edge of the bathtub, her eyes catching a glimpse of his bare chest. Although he was immersed in the water, she could still make out his well-trimmed abs. Are you done staring? He asked, jolting her back to reality. Instinctively, her hands reached for his first foot, rubbing slowly at first before increasing the tempo on his demand. I want my waist massage too. Was this man so shameless? Did he really want her to massage his waist? How was she going to do that without putting herself in an awkward position? She hesitated, silently praying for him to change his mind. What are you waiting for? He barked. Her left hand reached under the water until she felt his waistline and began to massage gently. Suddenly her hand strayed and touched the bulge between his legs. She flinched and quickly withdrew her hand, but not before he grabbed her by the neck and pushed her into the bathtub. Even in the water, he continued to press her neck, almost choking the life out of her. I should have known you were looking for an opportunity to touch me, I sneered. She struggled in the water, kicking and splashing water all over the bathroom. Satisfied with her squirming, he brought her out of the water and made her face him. Don't you dare try this next time, he sneered, shoving her out of the bathtub. She wouldn't dare it, not after what he had just done to her. He knew it wasn't her fault. He had seen the shock on her face, and it seemed convincing enough. But that smell, it was the same smell from the night he saved a helpless girl from being assaulted by her boyfriend. The same night he got into an accident that left him unconscious for years. She trembled as she ran out of the bathroom, almost in tears. He let himself back into the bathtub, an obvious grin crossing his face at the thought of her crying because of him. She ran into her room and met Madame Jones' probing gaze. Madam, what happened to you? Joan asked. Nothing, Jane hastily answered before dashing into the bathroom to rid herself of her wet clothes. When she was done drying up, she changed into a new set of clothes and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. Suddenly, the door opened and John was standing there, his eyes more threatening than ever. He angrily threw a report at her, his bloodshot eyes shooting daggers. Is this why you wanted a divorce so badly, you despicable thing? How dare you? He shouted. She stared at him in shock, wondering what he was talking about. Did you think I would never find out that you're pregnant? He continued. Before she could open her mouth to speak, he strode over to her, shaking in fear, and slapped her hard across the cheek. You are not just a gold digger. You're a whore too, he fired. Tears began to stream down her face as she thought of the trouble she was in with the news of her pregnancy. Speak up! Whose child are you carrying? He demanded. Jane felt her body grow cold with fear, and she began to tremble all over. I don't know, she stuttered. I won't repeat this question again, and trust me, if I don't get the answer I seek, you will be blamed for whatever happens to you. For the last time, who is responsible for your pregnancy? He shouted. It was true that she had never been with any man before him, and she couldn't remember sleeping with him either. I haven't been with anyone since I came into this house, she said, scared he wouldn't believe her if she told him she was still a virgin. John's anger surged even more. He grabbed her neck and began to squeeze it until she cried out for help. What other lies do you have up your sleeve? You can't think I'm responsible for your pregnancy, he snapped. Jane turned her head away, unable to meet his gaze. She was sure his eyes alone could kill her. The pressure of his hand on her neck increased, and soon she saw herself running out of air. Her face turned red from lack of oxygen, and a feeble hand clung to him in pain. "Please let me go," she pleaded. John gritted his teeth. "Are you going to tell me or not?" What could she say? She couldn't think of anything to pacify him. "I will tell you. Just let go first," she stammered. He stilled his hold on her neck, waiting for her to speak, his eyes growing impatient. "It's Ken's, right?" he accused. She shook her head in response. She couldn't agree to an obvious lie just to be set free from him. Tears glistened in her eyes, and her hands shook in fear. "Then who is it?" he demanded. "I don't know," she cried. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, he finally let go. Jane fell to the ground, gasping for air. The sudden relief made her understand the importance of life. "If you refuse to speak up, I will go about it my own way," he threatened. He immediately sent for Ken, who was oblivious to what he had gotten himself into, and rushed in almost immediately. Ken was taken aback by the scene before him. His elder brother was standing above Jane with a very mean look that sent Ken shivering like never before. As soon as John saw him, he handed him a piece of paper. Ken was left wondering what the paper was about. He took a quick glance at it and was about to return it to John when his eyes caught sight of the hospital name and the name boldly written on it. What did it have to do with him? Why was his brother giving it to him? He was even more shocked when he turned the document over and saw that it was Jane's pregnancy test result, and it was positive. "Wow, sister-in-law is pregnant," he announced excitedly, as if the others were unaware of the truth. As the words left his mouth, he immediately regretted it. John's anger surged to the top in an instant. Suddenly, Ken felt a heavy slap land on his face, leaving him totally dazed. "Why did you hit me? Tell me, are you responsible for the pregnancy?" John shouted. Ken stared at him in shock. "I swear I don't know what you're talking about. I do not—" Before he could finish the sentence, another slap landed on his cheek. He clutched at his cheek, moving backward to avoid getting hit again. "Brother, believe me, I have never touched sister-in-law," Ken pleaded. John rolled his eyes in disgust at the thought of his brother touching Jane. "If the baby isn't yours, then whose is it?" he demanded. Ken stared at him in shock. "Brother, isn't the pregnancy yours? I thought you—" "Oh, shut up," John snapped, cutting him off. "Does it mean sister-in-law had an affair while in this house?" Ken asked. But instead of responding, John threw him a disdainful look before strutting out of the room, leaving Ken gaping at the sorrowful Jane, who was sprawled on the floor in pain. Immediately after John left, Ken approached Jane and gave her a sly smile. "I should have known that you would frame me with your pregnancy," he taunted. "Attempting to seduce me wasn't enough. You even got pregnant with another man's child. How shameless of you." Jane pretended not to hear him. Ken became enraged with her calmness, and as he attempted to pull her up and teach her a lesson, he was suddenly stopped by an angry voice at the door. "Let her go this minute," the voice barked. Meanwhile, John locked himself in his study to avoid doing something terrible to Jane. From the fear on his brother's face, he could tell that Ken was not responsible for the pregnancy. Ken was a coward who would chicken out in the face of trouble. He was supposed to be happy that his prayers had been answered and Jane was finally getting thrown out of his house. But he didn't feel happy at all. It felt as if he had been stabbed in the chest, and the pain was excruciating. He couldn't believe that the woman he had thought was innocent was sleeping with another man while in his house. He wouldn't wait until his father returned before doing the needful. But before then, he would find out who the man was and make sure he was dealt with. In the kitchen, Jane couldn't believe her eyes. John's father was standing at the door with an expression she had never seen before. She had seen him angry at John a couple of times, but never so furious at someone like he was with Ken at the moment. "How dare you lay your filthy hands on her?" Mr. E asked, his voice trembling with anger. Jane stole a look at Ken, who seemed to be shaking in fear. "Father, when did you come back?" Ken asked. Mr. E ignored him and rushed to help Jane to her feet. Ken saw the opportunity to escape, But as he made to leave the room, he was dragged back by two guards who pushed him roughly to the floor where Mr. E stood holding Jane. "Take him away and have him punished thoroughly for messing with my daughter-in-law. And as for John, he better have a good explanation for the stories I'm hearing." "And what did you hear?" John's voice interrupted. He had changed into simple houseware and reeked terribly of alcohol. John was definitely shocked to see his father, and he was even more stunned to witness the guards leading his younger brother away. His father, cradling Jane with one hand, approached John and delivered a stinging slap across his face. "I wasn't joking when I said I would hurt anyone who harms Jane," Mr. E sneered. John was dumbfounded. His father had never laid a hand on him before. What did he mean by he would hurt anyone who hurt Jane? John hadn't even been in the room with Jane when his father arrived. So how did he know he was the reason behind her tears? "Father, you dare to slap me because of this woman?" John exclaimed incredulously. His father eyed him with disdain before leading the way to the sitting room. John was furious at his father, but even more so at Jane for turning his father against him. He hoped his father would apologize once he heard about her supposed escapades with other men. He waited until his father had taken a seat before settling in another seat far opposite his father's and Jane's. "I had to suspend my trip after I got the news of her pregnancy. I knew you would be furious, so I decided to return home before you did something stupid," Mr. E began, peering at John's angry face. "I have been aware of everything going on from day one, but I was hoping you would come to love her and adore her as you should." John recoiled in anger at the mention of love. He would never love someone like her, not even in his next life. "I know you've already made your conclusions, and I don't blame you for it. But I also know you've been treating her like a maid, making her do all your chores when we have plenty of staff in this house." "Isn't she worse than a maid?" John sneered, but his father immediately rewarded him with an icy gaze. "If you utter another word against her, you will regret what befalls you," Mr. E warned. Her eyes were already closing on the sofa where she sat with Mr. E when she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen and screamed out in agony. Mr. E grew terrified and alerted the guards, who rushed her to the hospital, the same hospital where Liam was being treated. After running a check on her, the doctor confirmed that it was nothing serious. Mr. E wasn't convinced. He was scared something bad might have happened to the baby because of the strenuous chores his son had made her do. "What about the baby, doctor? Is the baby okay?" he asked anxiously. "The baby is fine too. She just needs to rest more," the doctor assured him. Mr. E shot an angry gaze at his son. It was all John's fault that she was in such a condition when she needed to be taken care of the most. Jane was discharged the same day, and following Mr. E's instructions, she was led into the master bedroom instead of the usual maid's quarters. John was grumpy with the decision. He couldn't stand her presence, let alone having her in his room in his bed. That night after bathing, she wore her usual pink nightwear and settled at the far end of the bed. She didn't want to aggravate him more than his father had already done. John was not in the room at the moment, but just before she could doze off, she suddenly heard the door open and his presence filled the room. She forced her eyes shut, but no matter how much she tried, she found it difficult to sleep. She couldn't tell why, but a part of her finally concluded that it was because she was not used to the room. He had stayed away from the room from the minute his father forced her into his space. He had thought of sleeping in one of their numerous guest homes, but that would only make his father more pissed at him. He waited until he was sure she had fallen asleep before returning to the room. The room was dimly lit when he walked in. Apparently, she had turned off the lights, leaving only the table lamp beside the bedstand on. He took in her still form and wondered if she was fast asleep or pretending to be. Suddenly, he heard a soft squirm from her side. At first, he thought he hadn't heard correctly, but when he heard it a second time, he decided to check on her, against his earlier wish not to ever touch her. As he touched her, she jerked up in fear, and he had to hold her down to prevent her from falling off the bed. He didn't realize they were in an awkward position until he felt her hand on his neck and the other on his waist. He stared at her and noticed that she was fast asleep on his body. What the heck? What had he gotten himself into? He tried to disengage himself from her, but realized he wouldn't be able to do so without waking her up, which he didn't want to do. He carefully laid her down on the bed and lay beside her, still cradling her. Her head was now resting on the crook of his shoulder, and she was sleeping peacefully. Soon he could hear the sound of her soft snores on his chest. When he tried to disengage from her, she snorted and clung tighter to him. He finally gave up and lay beside her until he dozed off. It was morning already. She could tell by the bright sunlight streaming through the window. It had been a while since she woke up feeling so refreshed. As she attempted to stand up, she suddenly noticed a firm hand grasping her waist, and she couldn't move no matter how hard she tried. She grew terrified and pushed at the hand, but it didn't budge, nor did its owner. A look of shock crossed her face. Why on earth was John holding her? He had loathed the idea of sharing a room with her, and now he was holding her like they were some kind of intimate lovers. She was still processing the situation when the figure beside her shifted, and his hand on her waist became loose. She took advantage of the release and immediately rolled off the bed, but not before he pulled her back, his figure towering over hers. "Let me go," she pleaded. He shot her a disdainful look. "Isn't this what you've always wanted?" What was he saying? Before she could utter a word, his lips clamped down on hers and he suckled on her lips as if his life depended on it. She had always wanted to get intimate with her husband, but not this way, not while he was angry at her. She tried to push him off, but her struggle only intensified his grip on her. When she saw that he wasn't letting go, she stopped struggling and stayed still under him. But instead of continuing, John suddenly stopped, his face now filled with repulsion rather than desire. He pushed her until she landed on the floor with a thud. She scrambled to her feet and dashed into the restroom to wash up. In her haste, she had forgotten to take a change of clothes. After bathing, she peeped through a hole in the bathroom door. When she saw that he wasn't in the room, she decided to run in and pick up her clothes. But just as she entered the bedroom, the entrance door shut open, and John was standing there, shock visibly written on his face. Was she trying to seduce him? He brushed past her shaky form and went into his study without sparing her a glance. No matter how much he tried to concentrate, he found it difficult. His mind was clouded with images of her from the room. He had bedded many women in the past, but had never gotten worked up over any of them. In fact, he had never bedded a woman more than once. He always got tired of them after the first night. He finally decided to push the thoughts away and concentrate on his work. Suddenly, he heard a knock on the door. He knew it wasn't any of the servants. They wouldn't dare disturb him when he was in his study. "Come in," he muttered. The door slowly opened, and Jane was standing there, her dress unzipped. She pleaded with him to help her with it. At first, he wanted to ignore her, but when he saw that she wasn't going to leave him alone, he reluctantly stood up and began to zip up the dress. As his fingers grazed her bare skin, he sucked in his breath, hoping she wouldn't notice his reaction. When he was done, she thanked him and left for the room. Not before telling him that breakfast was ready and he was needed downstairs by his father. As he descended the staircase, his eyes caught sight of Jane sitting beside his seat. He knew his father had instructed her to sit there. He forced a smile and politely greeted his father, who seemed to be smiling for the first time since returning from his trip. "Son, hope you slept well," his father muttered. He wanted to tell him that his night was ruined by the woman he sent into his room and the drama she pulled. But on second thought, he decided it would only ruin his father's mood. Ken was seated at the far end of the dining room, munching his food. He muttered his greetings before continuing his meal. There were faint scratches on his face, and he looked like he had been given a good beating. Immediately, John sat down. His eyes went straight to Jane's swollen lips. He had never looked at her lips before, but as he did, he regretted it. He could still remember the lingering taste of her lips and how they submitted under his. "I have a confession to make," Mr. E began, startling them. The trio looked up at him in shock, wondering what the confession was about. "John, my son, I want you to know that the baby Jane is carrying is yours," Mr. E continued. Did he have to bring the pregnancy up? John thought. He had expected something very important. He stared at them for a while before continuing. The night Jane was brought into the house, I was scared that you wouldn't recover. So I had one of the best doctors in town sedate Jane and had your sperm injected into her. Their mouths dropped open in shock and they stared at their father as if he were a stranger. As for Jane, her hands were on her lips and she was sobbing. She had been enduring all the pain and hardship inflicted on her by her husband because he believed she had cheated when all along the pregnancy was his. Mr. E left his seat and went to console her. It's okay, Jane. I promise no one will ever mistreat you again. John couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his fists on the table in anger before storming out of the dining room. Jane's POV after the meal, she decided to go see Madame Joan. She knew the elderly woman would be sick with worry since she hadn't seen her since returning from the hospital. "Young madam, where have you been?" Madame Joan exclaimed. Jane told her everything that had happened, from when she returned from the hospital to when she was asked by John's father to share his room with him. Madame Joan was ecstatic with joy. "I hope the young master comes to love you like his beloved wife," she muttered, enveloping Jane in a tight hug. "You really deserve all the happiness you can get." Jane returned to the room to find her husband only in his briefs. From the lingering cologne, she was sure he was getting ready to go out. "Dad wants you to accompany me to a dinner party, so go and get ready," John announced. Jane couldn't believe her ears. Was he really asking her to follow him out? She brushed past him and went into the dressing room. Her clothes might be cheap, as he once accused, but they were still beautiful, and she knew she could still turn heads while wearing them. She settled for a simple floral red gown with a thigh-high slit and picked black stilettos to go with it. After dressing up, she pulled her hair into a simple bun and placed pieces of rose petals on it. She stared at the mirror and blinked twice with satisfaction. The figure standing before her was that of a dashing young lady. She didn't know what to expect from John. Would he compliment her dressing or tease her for wearing worthless clothes and jewelry? Pushing the door open, she slowly made her way into the room and sat on the large bed. John's shoes for the occasion were laid out beside the bed. After what seemed like an eternity, he walked into the room. Jane could swear that her husband was the hottest man she had ever laid eyes on. He was clad in a black suit with a matching tuxedo, his hair neatly combed to the left side, giving him a boyish look. She smiled to herself at the direction her thoughts were heading. "Why are you smiling?" John asked. She had thought she was fast enough, but apparently her husband had seen her before she wiped the smile off her face. "Nothing, just remembered something," she replied. He was expecting to see the ordinary girl he despised, but instead he saw an astonishing woman. She looked so beautiful and classy that he had to restrain himself from taking her into his arms. He quickly scolded himself for imagining such a thing about her. At the party, John refrained from introducing Jane to any of his friends. Although most of them knew he was married, they also knew how much he loathed his wife and how he would never bring her to any occasion he was invited to. But as they walked in, he noticed the way the men had their eyes on her, as if they wanted to undress her with their gaze. It made him angry and uncomfortable at the same time. He didn't care about her, but he couldn't stand the thought of another man having her either. He distanced himself from her and made her sit alone while he busied himself with some classy girls who were swooning around him since he walked into the party. All the while, his mind kept drifting to where Jane sat. She was no longer alone. She was now in the company of a young guy, and he seemed to be cracking her up with whatever he was telling her. John felt something in him squeeze in anger. She had never laughed at anything he said, but here she was, shamelessly laughing at a total stranger's joke. Unable to stand the duo, he stood up from his seat and marched to where she was. Jane was shocked to see him and immediately stood up to meet him. Even in the dim light, she could make out the bloodshot stare he was shooting at her. "Who is he?" he bellowed. She stared at him in fear, hoping he would calm down without creating a scene. "He was just keeping me company," she pleaded. Not satisfied with her response, he roughly pulled her out of the place and into the car. "Since you can't respect simple orders, you will stay in this car alone until the party is over." She didn't want to argue with him. She was even grateful. She would lie down and sleep while waiting for him. When John saw that she wasn't arguing with him, he locked the door. Just as he was about to leave, he saw the same guy coming toward them. He might flirt with her while she's in the car, he thought, and made up his mind to stay in the car with her until the party was over. She expected him to return to the party, but here he was, back inside the car. Did he change his mind? She stole a glance at his expressionless face, but couldn't make out what he was thinking. Suddenly, his hands reached for her face, and he pressed his lips down on hers. This time, it was less demanding, and his grip on her wasn't as firm as before. She had wanted to push him away, but suddenly her hands strayed to his neck and held him, urging him on. He deepened the kiss, his hands caressing her lower back, sending shivers down her spine. What was she doing? She couldn't possibly be giving in to a man who treated her so badly. She tried to push him away, but he was stronger, and with his body looming over hers, it was difficult to do anything. She relaxed, hoping he would release her like he did the last time. But instead of pushing her off, he began to nibble her neck. He started with tiny bites until she grew feverish with need. She brought her hands back to his neck and straddled him. He moaned into her ear before slowly releasing her. She was disappointed. Did she do something wrong? Why was he leaving her after turning her on? She looked so beautiful and classy that he had to restrain himself from taking her into his arms. He quickly scolded himself for imagining such a thing about her. John hooked their seat belts and turned on the ignition. He couldn't explain what had gotten over him. If he hadn't controlled himself, he was sure he would have had her right there in the car. They drove in silence until they arrived home. She waited until he had gotten out of the car before following suit. If she did something to infuriate him, she might as well stay away from him to avoid aggravating him further. She slowly made her way to Madame Jones' room and knocked on the elderly woman's door. "Young madam, are you okay? Did you quarrel with the boss again?" Madame Jones asked, shocked to see her. After narrating what happened at the party, the elderly woman smiled. "I think the boss has fallen for you already. He's only being overprotective of what is his," she taunted. The elderly woman advised her on what to do and asked her to go back to her husband, even though Jane insisted on passing the night in her room. John was sleeping on the bed when she walked in, his chest bare and only in his pajama pants. She changed into her nightwear and went to her corner of the bed. Just as her back touched the bed, John's eyes slowly opened. "Where did you go?" he asked. I went to see Madame Jones," she stuttered. John rolled his eyes at her. "Go to sleep," he sneered. She didn't want to sleep. She was no longer sleepy. She pretended to sleep while John stared down at her in anger. Why did he want her to sleep when she wasn't tired? She watched as he drifted off, and out of curiosity, she strayed her hands to his bare chest. He looked so peaceful when he was asleep, she thought as her exploration continued. At first he showed no reaction, but after a while he pulled her hands off his body and pushed her down until she was under him. "Let me show you how it's done," he whispered in a husky tone. He kissed her softly on the lips, and when she didn't struggle, he deepened the kiss. His hands caressed her body through the opening of her nightgown. She stiffened and clung tighter to him. Then he pulled away and stared at her flushed face and swollen lips. He was enjoying her responses to his touches. He was eager to explore her body further, but felt he needed her permission first. "Do you want me to continue?" he asked. She nodded and he gave her a wicked grin. His hand went for her gown and he carefully pulled it over her body, leaving her exposed skin to his view. She was beautifully attractive, with flawless skin. He released a gasp as she tried to cover her body in shyness. He smiled at her, then pulled her hands away. "I want to see you," he said. She relaxed under his gaze. His hands circled her mounds, and she rewarded him with a moan. Suddenly, Jane screamed, "I don't want this!" John's eyes grew wide in shock. She had granted him permission a few minutes ago. Why was she suddenly changing her mind? He stared down at the bulge between his legs and winced in obvious anger. Was she so insensitive not to consider him? Unable to do anything further, he went for a cold shower. When he returned, she was already fast asleep. He sighed and lay down beside her, careful not to touch her, all the while cursing her for playing with his emotions. She could have stopped him before he got aroused. The next morning, he woke up to see that her side of the bed was empty. She could be wherever she wanted. He didn't care anymore. She had caused him enough pain already. As he prepared to have a quick shower before heading to work, he heard a knock on the door. "Sir, your father demands your presence downstairs," came the servant's voice. What did his father want from him again? He had done his part by accepting Jane against his will. He pulled a shirt over his body before strutting down the stairs to see his father. Mr. E was dressed in a brown suit with a wide grin on his face. "Son, I was wondering if you would be free to accompany me to a fundraising event," he said. John was about to accept until he heard his father say, "Alongside your wife." His face creased into a frown at the thought of stepping out with Jane. The last time he went out with her, it was a total disaster. "Dad, I need to be at the office before noon. I'm sure the meeting can be postponed. Call your personal assistant and have her reschedule it." That was it. His dad wasn't going to change his mind for any reason. He immediately excused himself to get ready. Jane was inside the dressing room when he returned. She was clad in a simple floral gown that stopped right at her knees, her hair down, giving her an air of aloofness. She also had simple makeup on her face. "I was wondering where you were," she started upon seeing him. "Your dad was asking for you." John spared her a glance before walking into the bathroom to have his bath. She was such a good actress for putting on such a show after messing up with him last night. He would make sure to pay her back in her own coin. The E family arrived at the event looking as intimidating as ever. Most of the attendants had their eyes on Jane. It seemed it was her first public appearance. Just like at the party, most of the men were staring at her in a way he found disturbing. Before he knew it, he was offering her his arm and holding firmly to hers. She had expected him to leave her alone like he did the last time. She had prepared to keep herself busy on her phone during the function. But with the way her husband stood beside her, it almost made it impossible to move to any part of the venue without him accompanying her. The feeling of being around him was both sweet and strange. She liked the attention, but also loved the fact that he wasn't willing to admit his growing emotions for her. She could tell he was clearly falling for her. She saw it in the way he stared at her and his overprotective nature. Madame Joan had told her that men only protect what they cherish. When Mr. E was called to make the opening remark, she was shocked when he called out her name and dedicated the fundraising speech to her sick brother. How did he know? She was sure she hadn't told him about it. She waited until he was done before rushing to meet him. "Sir, how did you know that?" "Oh, you mean your brother?" "Well, you could thank your husband for it. He told me about Liam," Mr. E replied. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked at her rigid husband with gratitude. She had never expected someone so mean to have human emotions. She wanted to hug him and thank him for considering her brother, but she was scared he would push her away if she dared. After the occasion, just as they made for their car, she was shocked to see the faces standing beside her with their heads bent in shame. "Jane, we are truly sorry for hurting you," came the voice of her father. He was sitting in a wheelchair looking haggard in his appearance. She ignored them and opened the car door, but was restrained by her father-in-law. "Jane, my dear, you need to hear them out, please." She pulled herself together as she stared at the faces of the people who betrayed her and sold her to the E family. "What do you want?" she forced herself to ask. Her stepmother was the first to speak up. She didn't look her usual sophisticated self and appeared a bit slimmer. "Jane, please forgive us." What was she saying? Why would they want her forgiveness after hurting her so badly? Did they suddenly remember her after hearing she was pregnant with John's child? Did they even care to visit her when she was suffering in the hands of her supposed husband? She looked away, wiping her tear-filled eyes. "You treated me like I was nobody. You even sold me and yet never bothered to pay for my brother's hospital bills. How on earth am I supposed to forgive you?" He was already growing impatient with the delay. He had a meeting to attend and Jane and her gold-digging family were wasting his time. He looked at his father, who silently pleaded with him to wait a little longer to avoid getting pissed. He excused himself to talk with a lady he had noticed was staring at him during the function. She was a very pretty lady with a curvy body. He knew he wasn't going to enjoy whatever the lady was going to say, but he had to spare her the opportunity to distract himself from getting totally worked up. As they chatted and laughed, he suddenly noticed Jane's eyes on him. Even though she was talking with her family, her gaze seemed fixed on him. Was she getting jealous? She couldn't possibly be, he thought. She hated him, and the feeling was mutual. On their way home, he kept stealing glances at Jane. Her face was expressionless, and she didn't bother to look at him like she did in the past. He somehow wished she would look at him, maybe scold him for talking to another woman. But she did none of that. As for his father, he didn't look the least bit pleased. They drove in silence until they arrived at the office. He wanted to just step down while the driver took his father and Jane home. But as he clambered down, he saw Jane and his father following suit. Midway through the office, his father patted him on the back. "Son, I want Jane to see the office today," he said. John nodded as the elevator doors opened and they marched into his office. Thankfully, the meeting was a lengthy one, and he didn't have to be in his office all day staring at Jane. When he was done, he met Jane lying on the sofa in his office, fast asleep. Her hair was down, some strands sticking into her eyes. On impulse, he went closer and pushed the unruly strands of hair back. As he did, his fingers brushed her face, and her eyes immediately flew open. "So sorry," he stuttered. "Your hair was sticking into your eyes." "Thanks," she muttered, and turned over to continue her sleep. But sleep was already gone from her eyes. She took a peek at her wristwatch and saw that it was already past lunchtime. She had surely overslept in her husband's office. She stifled a yawn as she sat up on the sofa. John was staring at her, wondering what she was up to. When he saw her yawn, he figured she was hungry and immediately asked his assistant to get her some food. He saw the way she opened her mouth in shock when the food was brought to her. She muttered a thank you before feasting on the meal. After eating, he decided to take her around the office. But as soon as they stepped out the door, she missed a step, and he had to catch her. Her hands were curled around his neck as he steadied her. He could tell she was still weak, so he called his driver and asked him to take her home. But she insisted on going with him. "I still have things to attend to in the office. I can't go home now," she pouted, clinging to him. He had no choice but to follow her home. He had to carry her bridal style into the car and made her lie on his body inside. He was hoping she would fall asleep once they got home. But instead of sleeping, she clung to his arm while on the bed. What had he gotten himself into? Jane was beginning to bring out the weak and emotional side of him. He would never follow a woman's orders. Not even his mother dared to control him. But here he was, doing Jane's bidding. As if she heard his thoughts, she turned and cradled his cheek in her arms. Before he knew what was happening, she was kissing him with reckless abandon. What was wrong with her? Was she on something? All of a sudden, he made to extract his lips from hers, but she bit down on his lip in a way he found very amusing. Was she teasing him like he did to her? He was fighting not to be led on by her like last time. She probably wanted to tease him and leave him hanging, but as he made to push her off, he suddenly heard her plea. "John, make love to me." John wondered if this was another one of Jane's schemes to trap him, like she had done the last time. If that was the case, she could forget about it. He wasn't going to fall for her game again. As he turned his gaze away from her, he felt a painful tension between his legs. His groin was tight, and he didn't understand why. Jane was beautiful, but he had other stunning women at his disposal, ready to do anything to be in his bed. As he struggled to free himself from her hold, she reluctantly let go of his hand and turned her back on him. A pang of pity suddenly struck him. It seemed like she wasn't playing a game this time. The woman before him genuinely seemed to want him to make love to her. Making room for her in the bed was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes he had ever made. Immediately after leaning in and feeling her body against his, all of his resolve crumbled, and the self-control he had built up vanished. Jane shivered with desire as he stroked her body, the same body he had gotten lost in the first time he was tempted to make love to her. "Jane, are you sure you want this?" he asked, knowing it was a foolish question the moment he spoke it. Jane's response was clear. She moved closer to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. John buried his head between her breasts, breathing in her familiar scent. This was no coincidence. Jane was indeed the woman who had saved him from a brutal man the same day he had his accident. Regret suddenly washed over him. He had mistreated this woman all this time, even though she deserved none of the ill treatment he had inflicted upon her. He paused to look into her eyes. "Do you remember the night you were almost assaulted by a man a few years ago?" he asked softly. Jane nodded, and then a sudden realization hit her. "It was you. You're the one who saved me." John nodded and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Jane, I'm sorry for everything I put you through. Will you ever forgive me?" Jane smiled at him. "I've already forgiven you. Otherwise, I would never have offered you something so precious to me." John looked at her, suddenly speechless. He was surprised when he realized that Jane had never experienced anything this intimate before. She blushed, hid her face shyly, and then nodded. She smelled like heaven, and John was almost tempted to undress her in that moment and take her without restraint. "Are you sure you really want me to do this?" he asked again, seeking confirmation. Jane only smiled in response, encouraging him to continue exploring her body. John got up from the bed, and she let out a small sound of disagreement. "Calm down," he said reassuringly, trying to find a way to protect both of them. Jane rolled her eyes, looking at him with desire. He took a condom from his back pocket and quickly put it on. He watched her eyes widen in surprise at his size, a look he was used to. He slid back into the bed, kissed her passionately, and began working his magic on her breasts. Jane arched her back as he moved away from her lips to feast on the tender flesh of her chest. Her soft moans encouraged him to continue. John quickly removed the last piece of fabric covering her skin, leaving her naked before him. Her breathing became erratic. Jane noticed and smiled joyfully. "Why are you shocked? You said you'd seen plenty of naked women before," she teased. John couldn't admit that it was a lie. He had slept with many women, but none of them had made him feel like this. In that moment, a wave of jealousy washed over him at the thought of another man seeing her in this splendor. "I want to be your last," he murmured, drawing his face closer to her thigh. Jane tightened her thighs, almost denying him access, but he quickly won the battle, gently parting her legs. When his tongue touched her clitoris, she jolted violently, overwhelmed by a fresh wave of pleasure. "Stop torturing me," she begged. "Not yet, darling," he responded softly, covering her body with kisses. Her cries of pleasure and soft moans rewarded him for his exploration. John did everything he could to stop himself from taking her like an animal in heat. She seemed so fragile, and he didn't want to hurt her. He wanted to take his time. It was her first time, and he wanted this moment to be unforgettable for her. After finishing with his tongue, he slowly slid a finger into her opening. She climbed in pain before another wave of pleasure overtook her, and she arched her back to welcome a second finger. Jane gasped, her eyes closed. John watched her reach climax under his fingers before positioning himself over her, placing his manhood at the entrance of her body. As soon as the tip touched her, she arched toward him and took him in entirely. He had planned to take his time, but her body seemed eager to be fulfilled. He grabbed her waist to stabilize her as he pushed deeper. Her eyes were closed, and she gritted her teeth, a look he found very seductive. He wanted to increase the pace, but he wasn't sure if she was ready until she asked him to go faster. John changed position, kneeling on one knee before taking her from behind. As she screamed in pleasure, he muffled her cries with his hand, aware that the house wasn't soundproof. "Take it slow," he murmured gently, placing his hand over her mouth to stifle her sounds. John lightly spanked her, and she gasped loudly as she reached orgasm. She turned around and climbed on top of him, surprising him. "Are you sure you want another round?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, playing with his nipple. John smiled at her innocence, mocking her slightly. "The way you mounted me made me think you were a pro," he teased. Jane blushed deeply and looked away. John resumed his gentle movements, guiding her as she quickly learned to find her rhythm. She moved slowly at first, then increased her pace, whimpering and twisting her body seductively. She was a quick learner. When she grew tired, she gently collapsed on his body. John chuckled softly before lifting her and carrying her to the bathroom for a shower. After lifting Jane and carrying her into the bathroom, John carefully placed her under the hot water. They bathed together in comfortable silence. Jane, visibly shy, asked softly, "What do you think?" John looked at her with an amused smile. He couldn't help but find her adorable in her awkwardness, especially after what they had just shared. She tried to cover her breasts with her hands, but John burst into laughter, teasing her. "What exactly are you covering? You weren't this shy a few minutes ago," he remarked. Jane blushed immediately at his words, and the thought of her audacity made her smile despite herself. She sat facing him, trying to hide her embarrassment. John looked at her with newfound tenderness, appreciating her naivety and innocence even after everything they had just experienced. "Tell me, was it my father who made you change your mind about me, or did it come from you?" John asked, curious about what had suddenly made her so close to him. Jane bit her lip, hesitant, but finally answered with a mischievous smile. "From the first day I laid eyes on you, unconscious in that room, I felt something for you," she finally admitted. John blinked, surprised by her confession. He sank slowly into the water, his eyes never leaving Jane. "So are you going to stand there all day asking questions? Or are you going to join me?" he invited, making space for her in the bathtub. The offer was tempting, and Jane hesitated for a moment before sliding into the hot water next to him. The warmth of the water running down her bare skin and John's gaze on her made her heart beat faster. His head rested on John's shoulder as his left hand gently explored Jane's body, caressing her skin with growing familiarity. Jane suddenly felt overwhelmed by a new kind of pleasure, a soft, painful tension that engulfed her as John's touches became bolder. It was as if he knew every corner of her body, like he had always possessed her. At some point, he pulled away from her embrace and plunged his head underwater, causing ripples on the surface. Jane watched him with curiosity, unsure of what he was doing. She had thought they were merely there to bathe, but John's response was entirely different. Underwater, he dove into her intimacy and began licking her with an expertise that sent waves of pleasure through her. She tried to suppress a cry of satisfaction, struggling to close her legs, but John easily won the battle by lifting her legs, gaining complete access to her body. Jane twisted beneath him, her hands gripping John's head as he continued his intimate caresses. She felt each movement of his tongue like a wave of heat spreading through her entire body. When John finally surfaced, spitting out water, his eyes were slightly red from the time spent underwater. Jane let out a sigh of relief, water running down her skin as the marks of John's lips remained visible on her. That night, Jane slept better than she had in a long time. John's arms were wrapped around her, as if afraid she might slip away while they slept. She felt safe in the warmth of his embrace. She knew she was supposed to be angry with him for everything he had put her through, but that anger seemed to have vanished. Seeing him sleep peacefully beside her made her realize just how attached she had grown to him, despite everything. John shifted slightly in his sleep and opened his eyes, looking at her as if he hadn't expected her to already be awake. "Good morning, darling," he murmured with a slight smile. Jane tried to pull away from him, still sensitive from the pains of the previous night. John noticed her attempt to move away and teased her gently, grabbing her arm and pulling her back against him. "You're not trying to starve your husband, are you?" he joked with a laugh. "Shouldn't you be tired?" she asked, laughing as well. He pretended to pull her closer, but she pinched him playfully on the cheek before jumping out of bed. Of course, he was faster than her, and before she could even touch the floor, he grabbed her and brought her back to bed, pinning her under his body. "John, my body's still sore," she murmured, wriggling under him. John looked at her before bursting into laughter. "What were you thinking?" he asked, tracing lines on her lips with his fingers. "It wouldn't be good for the baby," she stammered, slightly embarrassed. John laughed even harder. "Don't worry, our little girl would appreciate the warmth coming from her father," he teased confidently. Jane smiled despite herself, amused by her husband's confidence. "So, what's it going to be?" John asked, looking at her with tenderness. "Let me go," she pleaded softly, hoping he would give in. Before she could say another word, John tilted his head toward her and captured her lips in a passionate kiss. This time, it wasn't a demanding kiss, but a soft, tender one. His lips seemed to fit perfectly with hers, and Jane felt a wave of desire surge through her. She wanted more. She suddenly found herself giving in to the heat rising within her, her body responding to every kiss. Suddenly, John broke the kiss, a playful smile spreading across his lips. "You're not asking me to let you go anymore," he murmured, teasing her once again. This time it was Jane's turn to get angry. She pushed him away forcefully and rolled out of bed, secretly hoping he would come after her, but he didn't. They were having breakfast when Jane suddenly received a call from the hospital. The doctor informed her that her brother wanted to see her. She quickly got up from the table, leaving her plate half full, and rushed to get dressed. She hadn't even bothered to tell John, but as she made her way downstairs, she caught his worried gaze. "Did you plan on going to see your brother without me?" he asked, fixing his eyes on her. "Aren't you supposed to be at the office this morning?" she replied, trying to avoid his questions. Instead of answering, John got up from his chair and followed her to the door. "I'll drive you," he said calmly but firmly. During the drive to the hospital, Jane tried to engage him in conversation, but John ignored her almost entirely, turning away each time their eyes met. The silent treatment was already killing her inside. When they finally arrived at the hospital, she decided not to leave the car until she got a response from him. "John, I'm sorry," she began, cupping his cheeks in her hands, hoping for a reaction. John finally looked at her and smiled softly. "Say it again," he murmured, almost laughing. "Say what?" she asked, confused. "Call me darling," he replied, teasing her as he leaned in closer. Jane smiled despite herself, a quick, sincere smile. "You're so cheap," she joked, making fun of him. John leaned toward her, hooking his hand around her back, his lips just inches from hers. "Oh, really?" he murmured, his body almost fully leaning over hers. Jane shivered with desire, her hands wrapping around his neck. But instead of kissing her, as she had hoped, he gazed deeply into her eyes before softly whispering, "We're both shameless people." Blushing with embarrassment, Jane gently pushed him away, trying to compose herself. When they arrived at the hospital, Jane noticed Liam sitting on his bed. But before she could say a word, he rushed toward John and hugged him enthusiastically. She stood there frozen, not understanding why her brother, whom she hadn't seen in days, was ignoring her to greet John with such enthusiasm. Liam clung to John's hand, barely giving her a glance, which left Jane even more confused. She looked back and forth between her brother and John, who were completely engrossed in their own conversation, as if she didn't exist. John noticed her discomfort and motioned for her to come closer. Jane made her way toward them, but her face betrayed her confusion. "Can someone tell me what's going on here before I lose my patience?" she barked, unable to contain her frustration. John detached himself and placed a reassuring hand on Jane's shoulder. "I guess I owe you an explanation," he began in a calm tone. "After the day I ran into you at the hospital, I wanted to learn more about Liam's condition and understand why he wasn't receiving the care he needed." He took a deep breath before continuing. "At first, I thought you were trying to sell your shares to run off with another man, but when I found out you were doing it to cover your brother's hospital bills, I decided to pay the bill myself. I asked the doctor not to tell you. Since that day, I've been visiting Liam 3 times a day to make sure he's doing well." He let out a light sigh before adding, "Please don't be mad at him for not telling you the truth. It was my idea to keep it a secret." Jane stood speechless, her heart heavy with confusion and gratitude. She had always believed John was ruthless, incapable of showing the slightest bit of love or emotion, and yet he had cared for Joan, watching over her brother attentively. Tears began to stream down her cheeks as Liam rushed toward her, wrapping his arms around her. "Uncle John told me you're expecting a little girl. He said I could be her big brother," he said. At those words, Jane smiled through her tears and wrapped her arms around the 2 men who had suddenly transformed her life. She didn't know how to express all the gratitude and love she felt in that moment. A few months later, Jane was in her room, nursing their daughter Amanda. Her husband John suddenly entered the room with a frown on his face. "Is it normal to be jealous of your own baby?" he asked, a mix of amusement and worry in his voice. Jane looked up, visibly confused. "Why do you say that?" With a mischievous glint in his eye, John responded, "You haven't given me a single second since Amanda was born." Jane had expected him to be joking, but when she looked closer, she noticed that his smile had been replaced by a slight frown. He seemed genuinely upset. She carefully placed the baby in her crib and approached him. John stood leaning against the wall, looking like a child who had been rejected. As Jane drew near, a smile spread across his lips, and he immediately scooped her up, placing her on his lap. He captured her lips in a passionate kiss, as if he couldn't wait any longer to reconnect with her intimately. She responded with equal fervor, realizing that she too had missed their closeness. She wasn't the only one who had felt the distance. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story of Jane and John. If you did, you'll love this new story you see on your screen. It's 100 times more interesting and emotional than Jane and John's. Click on the video and we'll meet you there. Don't forget, we love you.